If you weren't there for the alpha launch release of ArcheAge all the way back in 2014, let me tell you, you missed out on a real special, unique MMO experience. While on the surface, it might look like yet just another Eastern tab target MMO, there were layers upon layers of really cool, fun, engaging gameplay systems that made ArcheAge a super memorable time. I mean, I would say personally, being there for the alpha of ArcheAge goes down as like one of my favorite MMO launches ever. It was really something unique. So if you weren't there and you don't know, or even if you do, I just want to take some time to recap some of the elements and the things about this game that I just loved so much. Yes, at its core, ArcheAge was a sandbox PvP open world crafting game. Combat was of the tab target variety, fairly simple there. It lines up with games like World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV, for example. They did have this interesting combo system though, where a lot of the skills in the game would have a base functionality, but then also a combo potential on top of it, where if certain conditions were met, it would apply additional effects. So for example, a lot of the time this would come in the form of increasing the damage by some percentage, but then there would be things like if an enemy was feared, you might have an ability that would then trip them, or you'd have an ability that if an enemy was already slowed, it would apply a stun, or if you had this particular defensive buff, using that ability would also then taunt enemies. And what this had you doing was trying to synergize the different skills that you had at your disposal, because it was limited. You didn't just have access to all of the available skills in the game for your particular classes, but you would try to pick skills that would apply debuffs and then have combo potential with the follow-ups of whatever you did. It was a really cool system, but that combat, it's tab target combo system aside, it's pretty basic. One of the first really cool things that I really liked about the game was the class system. So in ArcheAge, there are 12 skill trees, and each of these are full of active and passive abilities that will fill sort of the traditional fantasy class tropes. There's a tree that's like the warrior tree, a rogue tree, a mage tree, a ranger tree, a cleric tree, etc. And then from those 12 archetypal trees, you would select 3 of them, and then depending on the 3 that you chose, that would determine your class, making for a total of actually over 200 potential class combinations. So for example, one of the classes that I played was the Dark Runner, and this was like a melee PvP focused class. I had the Battle Rage tree, kind of like the warrior tree. It had charges, different melee attacks, and a whirlwind ability. Then I had the Shadow Play as my second tree, and that's kind of roguish with backstabs and stealth. And then the third tree I picked was Oromancy, which is a PvP utility tree. It had access to a blink, various buffs, and shields. So yeah, my class was like a melee warrior that could go stealth and do backstab damage with a bunch of PvP utility. However, if I then just swapped one of those 3 trees, it would completely change my class. So for example, if I kept Battle Rage and Shadow Play, but I changed from Oromancy to the Sorcery tree, then I was a Hellweaver. If I swapped to a Defensive as my third tree, I would become a Blighter. If I picked Archery, I would become an Outrider, so on, which then totals up to a list with the swapping of each of these trees of over 200 classes. It was just a really cool, and at the time for me, unique way to structure classes in an MMO. ArcheAge also hosted a full-on open world with no loading between zones and a ton of verticality. Hills, cliffs, mountains everywhere. And why this is interesting is because it was fully explorable. You could go up the sides of mountains, and there was also different scaling points besides actually just walking up a trail. There would be things like vines and ladders that you could climb with your character. The game had a mount system, but unlike more traditional mounts that you just summon and ride, these would actually follow you around, and then you could just click on them to mount on them at any given point. And what this allowed you to do is you could be in the middle of doing stuff and you could just quickly hop on your mount. Mounts also had special abilities, both just utility like speed and dodging and stuff like that. You could even get mounts that had combat skills on top of that. And then they had their glider system. So this was used for movement in the air, but unlike a traditional flying mount system in the game, it had its limitations because you had to glide from a height. So what this ended up doing was incentivizing climbing up on top of a hill or something and then trying to get yourself in a position where the glider would take you over a location. I liked this because it made it feel more rooted over traditional flying systems that just let you go anywhere. It just felt like a more immersive way of doing things. And so you combine the full-on open world with no loading screens, with a ton of verticality, with all of these mountains all over the place, the mount system and the glider system with just the danger of the world from PvE, but also PvP with other players, which I'll touch on in a moment. All of this just really led to a very, very immersive world. It was a very engaging world to spend time in, had you constantly paying attention, keeping an eye out for threats, and it was just fun. It was just fun to be in this play space. The game had this really cool system of trade runs. This was a great way to make money. Essentially, every single zone in the game would have these specialty items that could only be crafted in that zone. So you would go to a zone, you would construct a trade pack of said items, and then the whole idea was the further away you carried it from where it was crafted, the more money you would get, basically. You would go to these special vendors, turn them in, and then depending on the distance you traveled, you would make more money. And early on, especially in the alpha, this was a pretty good way of making some cash. The problem was, though, while you're moving with a trade pack, you were very slow. Just the general walking speed was very, very restricted. So the solution to this would be to find various vehicles, like you could hop in the back of carriages that would move along the roads, you could find yourself an airship, or jump on a boat, which again lets you carry that trade pack at a quicker pace. The problem, though, is that all along with this, with your open world and with your trade packs, you were dealing with other players because this game has full-on open world PvP. There are two main factions in the game, the West and the East essentially, as well as a third pirate faction, and there are some fairly hardcore PvP systems. Basically, as you're playing around level 30, you would be pushed into the enemy faction zones, and then those zones would fluctuate between this status of peace and war. While in war, it would be full-on free-for-all PvP. However, while in peace, PvP could still happen. There was a flagging system, and even players of your own faction could flag and attack you. To go along with this, though, they had this crime system where if you ran afoul, you could be sent to jail, and then you would go on a trial by peers. It's like an RP session in the game where there's other players on your server deciding your fate. So that jury of players would see a list of every crime that you committed. For example, if you stole from someone else's farm, if you killed a member of your own faction, or if you did anything else deemed as illegal, the list of crimes would be published, and the jury would see what you did, and they'd be like, okay, you did this, that, and that. You killed a player of your own faction. You stole his stuff from his plot. We're going to send you to jail. But you could try to defend yourself, because there would be like a chatting period where the person on trial, like, that happened to me. I liked the open PvP. I flagged it, killed some people, took their stuff, and I went to jail, but I managed to defend myself. Just some smooth talking, got my way out of jail time and went to scotch-free. Or sometimes you'd get sent to jail, and they also had the system of while you're in jail, you could either wait a set amount of time, or there was a way of escaping, and then you would be like a criminal. And that whole crime system also played into the pirate faction, where if you break laws enough time, if your reputation becomes poor enough, you become a pirate. This was the third faction. Pirates are unable to enter any of the major cities of either of the two main factions, but they do have their own small pirate island in the middle of the ocean. So speaking of which, outside of the landmass, the open world, fully explorable landmass that you can do gliders and all this stuff, there was also a huge ocean which directly played into the play space, because there are boats in the game. You're able to craft your own boats of different varieties. You'll start off with this little raft, and then you can make this kind of solo sloop boat, but they also had massive like galleons that you could potentially craft. To go with this, there was open water PvP, where the pirate players would try to attack you, or if you're doing trade pack runs, someone can try to kill you and take that trade pack from you as you're trying to carry it from one continent to the next. There was also sea creatures, like a massive giant kraken, which I was unfortunately surprised by the first. I didn't even know about it until I tried sailing across the ocean, and he destroyed my boat in the middle of the water. And my boat was gone. There was a very in-depth housing system. Areas all across the game would be designated for player housing. You would get these blueprints and then put them to any available space, and that became your plot. And then you bring the resources required for that house to slowly construct it. Once it's finished, there was a ton of customization. You could put stuff in there for crafting and utility, bonuses, buffs, stuff like that. They're like towns. You would just go somewhere where there were housing plots, and you would just see everyone in your server who built a house there. You could just go up to it, whereas a lot of MMOs just do full-on instanced housing where you have to like zone into someone's housing area or whatever. No, you would see a player's house in their exact location, and if they had it open to visitors, you could just walk in, you could use their crafting stuff. It was a really, really cool system, and again, one of the many things in ArcheAge that was super, super immersive. Farming was a big thing as well, sort of like housing. You would place farming plots, and you could put stuff like plants and animals that you would have to tend to. They would grow up, and then you could harvest their resources. Players would even create these illegal farms. So when you had a farm on a a designated plot that was your own, that you were paying taxes for. Stuff that you have in there is safe as long as you upkeep it. But some people wanted more stuff. So if they wanted to harvest a bunch of trees, they would plant illegal farms and hide them somewhere, like up in the mountains where they don't think players are going to see them. And then once they wait the 12 or 24 or however many hours it takes for the individual things they're harvesting to grow, they would go back and get them. And that was a great way to try to rake in extra money without having to be tied to your relatively small farming plot. However, they're called illegal farms because they're not protected by anything, and other players, if they happen to stumble across them going through the mountains, they could find them and take them. There was just such a cool push and pull dynamic with the open world PvP and the farming and the illegal farms and the thrill of all of that, knowing that players even of your own faction can get in your way. It just made for it was just a very immersive experience. One of the many things that ArcheAge did very, very well. And then the gear crafting. The best gear in ArcheAge was crafted, but there were high levels of RNG in this crafting system. From the get-go, even in the alpha, this was one of the biggest things that I was a little bit worried about. So basically, gear works in a tiered system. Like, you would make the first tier bow, and then that bow would be used in the recipe for tier 2, and then that tier 2 bow is in the recipe for the tier 3 bow, so on and so on. And with each tier, you also would have a % chance to increase the item's rarity from white to green to blue to purple, etc. But as you go up each tier, the probability to fail getting that upgrade would increase substantially until you were getting like fractions of a percentage in the higher tiers. So some RNG systems, but sort of like in traditional MMOs, it is RNG if you're going to get loot from a boss. Having RNG in a game where the loot is primarily coming from crafting, it makes sense that there should be some in there. But honestly, in the alpha, that was like one of my only criticisms, especially since all of this crafting was tied to a labor system or an energy system where you only have so much labor in any given day across your entire account, and you would have to pick and choose where to spend that energy, whether it's crafting items or constructing, tailoring, weaponry, whatever. Once you ran out of energy, that was it. So ArcheAge was a really, really interesting game with a lot of unique systems, and I really barely just scratched the surface. Let me just tell you though, it was super fun, really engaging, really interesting, and I was in love in my time playing through the alpha, and then they completely ruined it. Most of the biggest problems came just prior to its official release with patch 1.2, which was dubbed by the community as the cash shop patch. So they were selling labor points, those things that you are using and a resource you're having to invest into the crafting system. And as I said, crafted gear is the best gear in the game. You can imagine how selling those points and expediting that might be a problem in an open world sandbox PvP game, right? So for one, there was a subscription that you could purchase which would increase your passive labor regeneration rate, but they also sold potions that you could chug once every 4 hours that would give you extra labor on top of that. So all of this means that if you're paying for this extra labor, you're able to craft the gear, boats, homes, everything at a much higher rate than free-to-play players. And then there was the Archeum supply crates. So Archeum crystals are these items that are needed to craft the very highest level items in ArcheAge. In conjunction with nerfing some of the in-game ways to acquire those crystals, they then also started selling them in the cash shop. And then there was also the regrading ability, which was sold. This was basically a chance to roll to get an increase in an item's rarity. And again, because the best gear in the game comes from crafting, and because they are selling multiple ways to make your crafting faster, easier, and better, they basically, in one single patch, just buried the game. The labor situation was also extra gross because it incentivized players to purchase extra character slots and have a bunch of alts who would then purchase labor points on those individual alts because they were restricted per character. So they were like, hey, if you want to maximize your labor, you're going to buy more character slots, make those alts, and then on each of your characters, purchase those extra labor potions every 4 hours. It was really gross and super predatory. It's simple, really. ArcheAge became very pay to win. It gave players who swiped such a massive gear and power advantage that they would wipe the floor with any of the free-to-play players. And don't forget, ArcheAge is a full open world PvP game, and that's all it took to completely kill it. And this isn't even taking into account issues like bots taking all of the available house and farming space in the land rushes when the servers first opened, or changes to the stat system, which completely gimped healing at release, or the duping exploits that took place, completely destroying the in-game economy, so on and so on. There were just so many missteps that ruined ArcheAge, which is such a tremendous shame because it was such a great game. Now, they tried re-releasing the game a few times. They had a Steam release of the original base ArcheAge, but then they also made ArcheAge Unchained, which originally was promised to be a one-time purchase with no pay to win. They've also had numerous fresh start server events, but none of these attempts really caught much wind. So this brings me now to ArcheAge 2. We've known about this game that was in development for a while, but just last week they officially revealed and announced the game, releasing a trailer and developer interview. So in the trailer, we see some pretty cool things. For one, the game looks gorgeous. It's being developed on Unreal Engine 5, and visually it is quite impressive. They opened up with like a ship sailing across the ocean, and we got various vista shots with like different landscapes, biomes. We see the middle of some bustling city. They got players riding on horseback in what appears to be them going into PvP. But then they showcase the action combat system, which is a pretty big divergence from what was the tab target of the original. We see a bunch of like skill-based time dodges, jumps, and dashes. We also see what look to be finishers with these like animations for taking down an enemy once they get to a certain health. And we see a bit of enemy variety, like there's dragons, ogres, some wraiths. We see a few different types of weapons like swords and axes, different kind of magical maces. And yeah, the like just over a minute gameplay trailer that they released, which is really kind of just like cinematic shots of in-engine footage, but it looks great. Like this game looks absolutely fantastic. And I am interested in checking out how they're going to approach action combat, because again, that first game was just full-on tab targeting. It wasn't even soft lock. It was just traditional tab target MMO. So this is a bit of a divergence, but nevertheless, it is more so the systems and the features of the original game that made it so good. The combat was just what it was. Now, we had a developer interview and they touched on a few things, basically just saying, hey, much of what made the first ArcheAge good, we're going to bring and try to improve in ArcheAge 2. The interview was with the executive producer, Jake Song. He said that ArcheAge 2 is a seamless open world action MMO. It's being developed as a multi-platform game, which will be coming to PC and console. In terms of major features, he focuses on the action combat, as well as producing an immersive storyline, and that they're targeting AAA visuals, which we clearly saw on display with that UE5 footage. It looks really good. Systems returning include things like trade runs. They're bringing it back and they're going to try to enhance it, making it so that solo trade runs are possible. You'd have these super valuable resources that you're trying to carry as far as possible, and the further you go, the more likely you are to run into other players. It doesn't even have to be the enemy faction, because your own faction can flag themselves and take you out to steal your goods and turn it in for their own reward, for their own money. So curious how they're going to help push the game in a direction where solo trade runs become possible, and we'll have to see. And they also touch on the fact that housing was a big feature in the first ArcheAge, and it will be making a return, and they would be improving the customization and also allowing players to live in towns with their friends and even create towns with specific guild members. Very curious the route that they go here. How are you going to let people create towns with their friends unless you are designating spots where people just can't grab whatever free space is available, which was the case in the first game. Now, we do know a bit more about the game as well. Specifically, while there is no current exact release date, XL Games have said that we can expect it to arrive sometime in 2024. So still a few more years of development to go. They've reportedly got a studio of roughly 100 people working on the game right now. So I mean, frankly, even just from the short amount of footage and what they've said about ArcheAge 2, which really is very little, I am looking forward to it just as a game with just how much and how special ArcheAge was on so many different facets. If they even take some of the lessons from that original as a game experience, this is probably set to be a pretty awesome MMO. I'm really curious about a lot of things, in particular how they're going to handle action combat, that shift from tab targeting, and what kind of features they're going to carry over from the original. But if they can do the open world thing, if they can have that immersive exploration, if they return the super in-depth sailing system and the housing and trade pack runs, and how they handle PvP in the open world and the jail system, and just that laundry list of things that made the original game really cool, if they can bring that in ArcheAge 2, awesome. The problem, though, is what level of expectation do I have that they're not going to destroy it with their monetization? Oh, I'll tell you, it's zero. I have zero. Like, it's almost guaranteed that ArcheAge 2 is going to be pay to win. I would so love to be wrong, because I cannot tell you how much. Doing the research and going back and like watching my old ArcheAge alpha videos, I had a handful of them up here on the channel. It reminded me just how in love I was with this game in its alpha state. It was such a cool, there were just all of those features coming together really made for a very, 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 very fun experience. It's one of my favorite MMO launches patches. I mean, I know it was just an alpha, but experiencing it fresh through my eyes as a player for the first time, going through with the release of the alpha and playing with all of these people and just going through that experience, it was great. And it's just such a travesty, honestly, that they ruined it and they botched the release as badly as they did. Otherwise, we would probably be talking about ArcheAge to this day. It really was that special. If you're watching this video and you didn't play it, I understand if you don't get it, because just looking at it, even just watching gameplay, and even with me explaining the systems, I don't necessarily know that it fully translates how immersive and engaging this world and the systems, the way everything came together in concert. It was just great. It really was. As much as I want to be excited for ArcheAge 2, and like with anything that's even vaguely interesting to me, I'm gonna follow development. When it becomes playable, I'm going to play it. But my expectation is they're just going to trash it with monetization, because boy, that was 2013 when they destroyed this game. And it was a way different environment in the space of gaming. Gaming monetization, just like the bar of predatory is so much higher now, just like the base level compared to what it was in 2013. And I just have to say, there's almost no way it won't be bad with this game as well. But I hope I'm wrong. I mean, yeah, sure. The dream is this game comes out and it's just got a box price and they're like light on a cow's cosmetic shop or something. But in reality, that's not my expectation. I'm going to assume full on free to play with a full blown cash shop, given how aggressive their cash shop was almost 10 years ago. I think the most that I can hope for at this point is that they go cosmetic with the light convenience route. So sure, sell skins, go ahead, whatever. Maybe sell gliders and mounts as well. But please, for the love of God, do not tie anything to crafting. Assuming that crafted gear will remain the best gear in the game as it did in the original, just don't put anything in the shop that pertains to accelerating or improving crafting, making it easier. Keep them separate. I hope they can do that without pushing into the pay to win, and I hope they can deal with the land rush issue, and I hope they can deal with bots. I hope they can do this right, but hope as hard as I might, and as much as I want to be super enthusiastic for this game, I can't. I just really can't. But again, I will follow development. I will play it when it's playable, and I'll just have to keep my fingers crossed that they don't botch it this time. Even if they end up going the pay to win route and I have to just enjoy it for a few weeks before dodging all of the credit card swiping people who are going to destroy me in open world PvP. If I can even somewhat rekindle what that original alpha brought, that I'm fine with that too. Whatever. If they want to bury their game for the second time, so be it. I really don't mean to be a doomsayer, but I'm just trying to be realistic here with my level of expectation. Hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. All right, guys, that does it for me today. Thank you as always. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time. Take it easy.